Have you ever noticed those really subtle, almost invisible things your body does when you're anticipating something difficult?
Oh, absolutely. Like clenching your jaw without realizing it.
Right. Or, maybe you're waiting for some lab results or anticipating this really tense performance review at work or even just sitting in standstill traffic when you're already 10 minutes late.
Yeah, your whole body just tightens up.
Exactly. If you really pay close attention, you'll find that you're actually holding your breath. Your shoulders are braced right up by your ears. You're physically contracting, kind of operating under this unspoken assumption that you'll finally exhale and, allow yourself to be okay just as soon as the external situation is resolved.
Which is such a universal experience.
Yeah.
We completely treat our own well-being as this finish line we have to cross.
We really do. Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. We are looking at a really fascinating synthesis of reading today. It draws from a profound contemporary philosophical essay on equanimity, and we're cross-referencing that with some brand new clinical psychology research on somatic states and nervous system regulation.
It's a great combination of sources.
It really is. And the mission for our time today, for you listening, is to fundamentally flip the script on how you view your own baseline of happiness. We are unpacking a framework that treats peace not as like a reward you get when your life is perfectly organized, but as the foundational ground you stand on while your life is still a highly unpredictable, sometimes total mess.
Yeah, because let's be honest, life is rarely perfectly organized. The primary text we're analyzing introduces this really powerful concept. It calls it the suspended sentence.
The suspended sentence, I love that phrasing.
Right, because most people live their entire lives in that state. You're just waiting for the relationship conflict to blow over, or the financial anxiety to lift, or, I don't know, waiting to get some elusive sense of closure from your past.
You're basically putting your actual life on hold.
Precisely. But the core argument across all our sources today is that choosing your own peace is this deep, living orientation that you have to choose actively. And the clinical data backs this up heavily.
Yourself.
Well, the biological cost of waiting for perfect conditions to be at peace, it actually compounds over time. You eventually pay for that chronic anticipation in your own tissues, your immune system, and even your cognitive function.
Okay, I want to challenge the fundamental premise right out of the gate here because I can already hear the skepticism from anyone listening who is, currently managing a really high-stakes life.
Bring it on.
If we decide to orient ourselves toward peace while our circumstances are actively chaotic, doesn't that inherently require a certain degree of apathy?
That's the immediate fear, isn't it?
Like, if I'm entirely at peace with my company facing bankruptcy or a massive crisis in my family, it really seems like I've simply stopped caring about the outcome.
Well, the texts actually anticipate that exact friction. We frequently conflate peace with indifference, but neurologically and psychologically, they're practically opposites.
Wait, really? Opposites?
Yes, indifference is actually a coping strategy. It's rooted in numbing. When an individual decides that caring involves just too much psychological pain, the nervous system engages a shutdown response.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, biologically, this is often linked to the dorsal vagal complex. It's basically a circuit breaker that trips when we are completely overwhelmed. It distances us from reality.
So indifference is basically a form of checking out entirely because the system is just overloaded.
Precisely. If you observe indifference up close, it has this very flat, dead, rigid quality to it. Genuine peace, on the other hand, requires what the clinical literature calls a ventral vagal state.
And what does that look like in practice?
It is warm, it's engaged, and it's highly responsive. When you're truly at peace, you are still profoundly invested in the outcome, but your caring is no longer contaminated by terror.
Contaminated by terror. Wow.
Right. You're operating with extraordinary presence rather than just acting out of a raw survival reflex.
That phrase, contaminated by terror, that captures so much of modern professional and personal life. But let's look at the social incentives here for a second.
Okay.
Because society generally signals that if a problem is serious, your level of visible stress needs to match the severity of the problem.
Oh, absolutely. It's a social requirement almost.
Exactly. Like, if I remain perfectly calm during a massive departmental failure at work, my colleagues might perceive me as completely oblivious or just irresponsible.
Well, think you don't get it.
Right. It feels akin to like running around the office clutching a fire extinguisher when there is no fire, simply to prove to management that I take fire safety seriously.
That is such a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And it's exactly what the philosophical essay calls the performance of responsibility.
A performance.
Yes, the essay addresses this pervasive misconception head-on. We have been completely conditioned to believe that demonstrating our suffering is the metric by which we prove our conscientiousness. The author uses a striking phrase for this, actually. They call it guilt wearing the costume of conscientiousness. We visibly carry the weight of the world just to signal our virtue to everyone else.
It's basically an exhausting theatrical production.
It really is.
But the clinical sources offer a pretty stark counter-argument regarding what actual responsibility requires, right? Because operating from a state of chronic anxiety, resentment, or shame, that actively distorts cognitive processing.
It absolutely does. When the amygdala is driving the bus, you essentially lose access to the prefrontal cortex.
So you can't think clearly.
Exactly. Your decision-making becomes extremely compressed and reactive. You basically develop tunnel vision.
Which means you're totally incapable of seeing the broader context, let alone generating any creative solutions.
Right. An inner architecture of peace is what actually allows for accurate, proportionate responses.
Proportionate being the key word there.
Yes. When you aren't filtering reality through a lens of panic, you stop reacting to the loudest alarm, and you start actually addressing the structural issues. You bypass that hypervigilant monitoring that inevitably leads to burnout.
Okay, so since inner peace actually renders us more capable and responsive, we need to transition into how these sources deconstruct and rebuild our entire understanding of well-being.
Let's do it.
Because the text moves away from these generic, self-help platitudes, and it categorizes the state into 4 specific orientations. And the first one is a radical redefinition of happiness.
Yes, the distinction between circumstantial and committed happiness.
Exactly. It draws a really hard line there. Circumstantial happiness is just, the dopamine hit of things going your way. It is entirely fragile.
And it's highly vulnerable to, like, the very next email you receive.
Yes. One bad email and it's gone. But the deeper, committed happiness described in the text is framed not as an emotion at all, but as a basic yes to one's own existence.
I love that definition.
Me too. It is a fundamental refusal to let external difficulty be the only narrative playing in your mind. Which leads directly into the second pillar, a concept that I actually found incredibly challenging in the reading, which is satisfaction.
Satisfaction. People struggle with this one.
I certainly did. The author suggests we have to measure our lives against our actual lived experience in the present, rather than constantly comparing it to some imagined, optimized future.
Right. It has a somatic quality to it, a physical feeling of completeness.
But I struggle with the practical application of this. I mean, if I'm looking at a roof that is literally caving in or a bank account that is heavily overdrawn, claiming to be satisfied, seems synonymous with just giving up on necessary goals.
It sounds like complacency, right? But the author clarifies that satisfaction does not equal complacency.
Okay, how so?
This is where we have to hold 2 seemingly contradictory truths at once. You can maintain a fierce ambition to repair the roof or to change your financial situation while simultaneously experiencing a somatic sense of completeness in the present moment.
So they aren't mutually exclusive.
Not at all. The desire for growth and the satisfaction with the present are parallel tracks of a life that is actively being lived. Satisfaction is simply the absence of the belief that your current reality is an intolerable mistake.
Wow. The absence of the belief that your current reality is an intolerable mistake. That requires a massive cognitive shift.
It really does.
Wanting a different future without harboring hostility towards your present. Okay, so that bridges us perfectly into the third pillar, which is the most physically tangible concept in the research: relaxation.
Yes, this is where it gets so interesting.
It really is. The sources emphasize that relaxation is not synonymous with leisure. It isn't the vacation you take once a year or the glass of wine on a Friday night. It is defined as a baseline muscular state.
And this is exactly where the integration of the clinical psychology research becomes so vital.
Break that down for us.
Well, we often think of the brain as the commander, right? Sending orders down to the body. But the neural pathways are primarily a friend.
Meaning they go the other way.
Exactly. Meaning your body sends vastly more information up to the brain than the brain sends down. So chronic physical contraction, like the clenched jaw, the braced shoulders we talked about earlier, that is a somatic manifestation of an adversarial relationship with reality.
Your body is perpetually bracing for impact.
Yes. Your body is telling your brain that you are under attack.
So, mechanically speaking, proprioception dictates perception.
Precisely.
If I walk into a complex negotiation with my shoulders locked around my ears, my physical tension is sending a continuous distress signal to my brain, informing it that I am under threat.
Yes, and a contracted body literally perceives threats more readily because it is biologically primed for them. It's looking for them.
That is wild.
Right. And conversely, a relaxed physical state perceives possibilities. This is pure nervous system mechanics. The physical state you are in determines the literal menu of options your brain can even access.
So maintaining muscular relaxation isn't just a luxury for when you're off the clock.
No, it is the most pragmatic strategy for maintaining high-level cognitive function in difficult environments.
Which makes the fourth and final pillar of this framework so crucial: peace with oneself.
The integration point.
Exactly. The text refers to this as maintaining a non-hostile relationship with who you actually are. And I mean, we spend so much time internalizing a harsh critic, totally under the assumption that self-flagellation is the engine of self-improvement.
We constantly use internal hostility as a motivational tool.
We really do. I have to be hard on myself to get better.
But here is the problem. The nervous system cannot distinguish between an external threat and an internal one.
Oh, wow. Okay.
If you are constantly at war with your own complexities, your flaws, your contradictions, your body remains in that state of chronic contraction. You cannot achieve that baseline muscular relaxation we just discussed if the call is coming from inside the house.
That is such a good way to put it. The call is coming from inside the house.
Right. A non-hostile relationship with yourself means remaining firmly on your own side. And that doesn't mean defending your poor choices. It just means defending your fundamental dignity.
I feel like the theoretical framework here is airtight. It makes perfect sense. But the friction always emerges in the application, right?
Always.
The sources spend significant time on what they call the commitment dimension.
Yeah.
Because the human mind is remarkably skilled at generating these, bespoke rationalizations for why peace is impossible right now.
Oh, we are masters at making excuses.
We tell ourselves we'll adopt this non-hostile, relaxed baseline just as soon as the current crisis passes.
It's the illusion that the waiting room will eventually empty out.
Mm-hmm.
But spoiler alert, it never does.
Never.
If you wait for your mind to stop generating reasons to be stressed, you will literally wait until you die. The commitment must precede the feeling. You have to anchor yourself in this orientation well before the environmental proof suggests it's safe to do so.
Okay, I have to introduce the most obvious point of resistance here.
I think I know what's coming.
We are talking about maintaining a baseline of peace, but what happens when you, the listener, are confronted with genuine tragedy?
Right, the big one.
Yeah. What about profound systemic injustice or the sudden loss of a loved one? Applying a no matter what clause of tranquility to catastrophic grief seems not just impossible, but honestly almost pathological.
It sounds like denial. But the author tackles this skepticism directly by dismantling our deeply flawed definition of equanimity.
Okay, what is the correct definition then?
Well, equanimity does not mean emotional flatlining. Grief, sorrow, clean anger, these are not the enemies of peace. In fact, denying those realities would just be a return to that numbing strategy of indifference we talked about earlier.
So profoundly difficult experiences are supposed to disturb your equilibrium.
Absolutely. The commitment to peace isn't a claim that you will remain entirely unbothered by catastrophe. That's not human.
Okay, so where does the distinction lie?
It lies in the architecture of the processing. When you possess a baseline of peace, the grief or the anger moves through your nervous system. You feel it in its entirety, but you do not collapse your entire identity into it.
You feel it, but you don't become it.
Exactly. It's the difference between experiencing the sensation of deep sadness and concluding that you are a fundamentally broken, permanently tragic entity. The feeling occupies the space, but there's a container of presence large enough to hold it without shattering.
The feeling is having the experience, but the experience isn't consuming the entirety of the self.
Beautifully said.
And the philosophical text proposes a really fascinating dynamic here. That the capacity for genuine happiness is not diminished by enduring difficulty, but is actually excavated and deepened by it.
Which is so counterintuitive,
Yeah.
right? We operate under the assumption that suffering chips away at our reservoir of happiness, like it's a finite resource.
Right, like every tragedy drains the tank a little more.
But individuals who process difficulty without numbing or avoiding it, they often discover a stabilizing internal anchor. They realize they contain a core that remains intact despite the external devastation.
And discovering that durability permanently alters your baseline orientation to the world.
It does. You realize you can survive the worst, which takes away the terror of anticipation.
That is so powerful. So we've examined how this framework applies to external tragedies, but we really need to address the internal failures.
Yes. when we are the problem.
Exactly. What is the mechanism for maintaining this peaceful baseline when we are the ones who cause the harm? How do we navigate our own mistakes without sliding into complacency and, just letting ourselves off the hook?
The sources introduce a highly nuanced metric here, which they call taking enough responsibility. And that word enough, it really implies a careful calibration between two equally avoidant extremes.
Okay, let's use a driving analogy
I
here.
love a good analogy.
It's like a car going into a skid on an icy road. Taking too little responsibility is like taking your hands entirely off the steering wheel and just closing your eyes. It's total avoidance of the discomfort.
Which obviously ends in a crash.
Right. But the other extreme, taking too much responsibility, is wildly overcorrecting the wheel. You spin the car out just as violently, but you do it while feeling like you are taking drastic action.
That analogy maps perfectly to the psychology of remorse. The text identifies excessive self-blame as the performance of remorse.
Another performance.
Exactly. Collapsing into agonizing guilt is highly dramatic, and it's incredibly emotionally consuming. We engage in this intense internal suffering because it acts as a substitute for the actual unglamorous work of changing our behavior.
We totally confuse feeling terrible with doing better.
That is exactly the mechanism. Both the avoidance and the excessive self-flagellation serve the exact same psychological function. They protect us from the quiet, difficult work of genuine confrontation.
Wow.
True responsibility is defined in the text as seeing clearly without cruelty.
Seeing clearly without cruelty. I want to underline that for everyone listening. You analyze your contribution to the failure, you identify the necessary behavioral shift, and then you just implement it.
Yes.
It doesn't require a public performance of your own guilt. It is simply the quiet, consistent realignment of your actions because your standard for yourself demands it.
You hold the accountability cleanly without the theatrical production.
So, to synthesize this immense stack of reading down to its core utility for you today, the ultimate objective of this deep dive is not to outline a strategy for detaching from the reality of a complicated life.
Not at all.
The objective is fundamental freedom. It is the specific freedom of relocating your center of gravity from the unpredictable external world and placing it securely inside yourself.
And doing that drastically alters the quality of your engagement with reality.
In what way?
Well, when you establish peace as your unconditional baseline, you are finally able to navigate high-stakes scenarios like critical negotiations, relational conflict, profound uncertainty, without your nervous system treating every single moment as a life-or-death survival test.
It lowers the stakes biologically.
Right. It is the transition from a state of managed desperation into actual, genuine participation.
You stop enduring your life and begin actually inhabiting it. Which leaves us with a final thought to consider before we wrap up today.
Okay, let's hear it.
We discussed the afferent neural pathways earlier, how a contracted, tight body sends threat signals to the brain, limiting your perception. But consider the social implication of that biology.
Oh, this is fascinating.
Right. We know from the study of mirror neurons that somatic states are highly contagious. When you walk into a tense room with a rigid posture and shallow breathing, you are actively co-regulating the nervous systems of everyone around you toward panic.
You're spreading the stress.
Exactly. So if perception is embodied and somatic states are shared, choosing your own internal peace is not just some private self-help exercise.
It's an act of leadership.
Exactly. The next time you walk into a room to face an unsolvable conflict, recognize that by simply dropping your shoulders, unclenching your jaw, and regulating your own breathing, you aren't just changing your own menu of options. You're fundamentally altering the biological reality of the room.
You become the anchor that allows everyone else's nervous system to finally exhale.
You really do. You don't have to wait for the world to calm down to find your peace. You can be the reason the world calms down. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.